looks like it's probably going to take a while. Oh, you should have gotten the notification that we are live on YouTube right now. There we go. All right. That are live on YouTube right now. So, um, and I am getting feedback. I will figure that out. So, anyway, I would just like to welcome everyone tonight. This is the volunteer monitoring debrief, and we are going to talk about what we did this summer. Well, what you did this summer. I didn't. So I'd like to introduce Jesse Wilkins and Jordan. They are going to be our presenters tonight. And we will be monitoring the chat. So feel free to drop questions as we go. And we'll, as I said prior to live streaming, we will have a question and answer time at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Jesse.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to share my screen here. Looking okay to everybody? All right, so I'm going to start with a bit of a presentation on how to interpret your water quality data or try to make sense of it. And then please chime in if you have questions or you'd like me to expand upon something further, or you're just wondering what the heck am I talking about. As Anne mentioned previously, I've had a lot of caffeine this afternoon, so if I go over something too fast, just ask me to slow down or back up. I'll do my best. And then once I'm done going through this, I would like to hear from some of you about your experiences and kind of how your sampling went, and if you have any suggestions for us of how we could accommodate you more effectively. But I'll start by talking about water quality data. And this horrible nightmare of a table is found in our integrated report for surface water quality. That's a big, thick document that we put out every 2 years. I have mine sitting here on my desk because, as you probably can't see it, I never leave home without it. And in that document, we describe or detail all the waters of the state that are meeting and not meeting their water quality standards. And this table comes from there, and this includes all of our standards for conventional parameters. So that's basically non-toxic parameters. So everything but heavy metals, PCBs, things like that. This table is helpful to understand how water quality standards work and what the framework is for how we apply standards to different water bodies, because every water body in the state has a somewhat unique set of water quality standards. They're not unique, but they're derived from different beneficial uses. Beneficial uses are listed up at the top of the table here, 1 through 11, and they are uses that are assigned to water bodies based on how how animals and humans utilize that water. So any of these 11 can be assigned to a water body, and with that beneficial use comes the water quality standards. So I'm just going to kind of go left to right across the top and talk about these. Number 1, domestic water supply. That is, if that water body is used as a drinking water source, then it will have a domestic water supply beneficial use assigned to it. Some examples of that are Lake Pactola out here. It's a drinking water source for Rapid City. I believe the Big Sioux River is used as a drinking water source, the Missouri River. It's fairly uncommon for lakes in South Dakota to be used as drinking water sources or domestic water supplies, but there are a few. And with that beneficial use of domestic water supply comes a series of standards that are designed to protect people so that they're drinking safe water. For example, you don't want your nitrate concentration over 10 milligrams per liter because it can cause blue baby syndrome, things like that. So the second beneficial use, and actually 2 through 6, are all fishery beneficial uses. And these are designed to protect the fish life in a lake or stream. And there's so many of them because our waters of the state are pretty variable. So cold water, permanent fish life propagation, and marginal fish life propagation, those are pretty much only found in the Black Hills for waters that are inhabited by trout. There is one on the Missouri River below Oahe Dam. And so the two colder water ones are designed to protect trout. 4, 5, and 6 are warm water fish life propagation uses. These are to protect, say, a walleye fishery, bass, and even including, say, the small chubs and minnows and dace in a stream. Those also are also protected by these standards. There's an oxygen standard associated with these uses because fish need oxygen to survive. Same thing with pH. You can't have too high or too low a pH. Ammonia is toxic to fish. So those standards come along with those fish life uses. As we move across the top, we get to 7 and 8, immersion recreation and limited contact recreation. And these uses are for people that are recreating around water. So number 7, immersion recreation, is basically swimming. Anything where your whole body and particularly your head might get submerged below the water. This is where our E. coli standards come in and our microcystin or algal toxin standards come in. So immersion is swimming. Limited contact recreation, number 8, is think more along the lines of kayaking without falling in, or fishing, or things like that. So then numbers 9 and 10, fish wildlife propagation, recreation, stock watering, and then number 10,
Jesse,
irrigation. Yes.
sorry. This is Rebecca Turk. Hey, can I ask a question? So there's 2 values in the table under E. coli for immersive and limited contact. Can you
Yeah,
speak to what those mean?
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I was going to get into this a little bit later as well, but this is a good opportunity to discuss it since your mind is on it. So the reason there's 2 is because we have the lower number. Looking at immersion recreation, we have 126 and 235. The 126 that's called the geometric mean standard. For this standard to apply, you have to have 5 samples collected within a 30-day period, and the geometric mean of those 5 samples has to be under 126. There are no volunteer groups or individuals that collect 5 samples within the 30-day period. So I don't typically talk about the geometric mean standards. And also when I say a geometric mean, that's a different calculation than a mean, or also known as an average. A geometric mean is different. The 235, on the other hand, is what's called the single sample maximum. And that's what's going to apply to the work that you guys are doing and the samples that you're collecting. And that means that any one sample should not exceed 235 colony forming units per 100 milliliters. Does that make sense, Rebecca? It's kind of
Sorry.
a lot.
Yeah, it does. It does
Oh,
make sense.
okay.
Um, yeah. Thank
We
you.
used to call them chronic and acute standards, but that language isn't actually accurate because there's a better descriptor, as I previously used for those. There's a lot of confusion about this. A lot of the time, people will apply that more stringent standard to their single samples, and it's not appropriate. It's an incorrect interpretation of the data. You have to have that 5 samples within a 30-day period. And we usually look at it as a calendar month. If you have 5 samples within a calendar month, then we'll assess for the geometric mean standard and see if that's exceeded. So yeah, that people get hung up on that one a lot, and there's a lot of confusion about that. Thank you so much for asking about that.
Yeah,
Does anybody
that
want to
was
hear more about that before I move on?
really helpful. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I left off talking about 9 and 10. Those are assigned to every water of the state. So little streams that run through a pasture, a slough, just about anything has the 9 and 10 uses assigned to it. You might think that every water of the state has an E. coli standard, but that isn't the case. Some very small tributary streams and other things like that, very small sloughs, don't have an E. coli standard. But they have the 9 and 10 standards or uses, excuse me, and the standards that go along with those. So there is a pH standard for every water of the state. There's some of these other ones, total dissolved solids, things like that, conductivity. And then the last one, number 11, commerce and industry. That's we don't see that one all that often, but that's so basically, as the name implies, commerce and industry are able to use those waters. So I'm going to move on from this big ugly table. And here's one example, Pactola Reservoir. Here's a list of its beneficial uses and whether or not they're being met. When we call full support, we're saying that all those water quality standards associated with that beneficial use are being supported or met. If we say it's not supported, that means that at least one of those water quality standards associated with that beneficial use is not being met. So in Pactola, you can see that everything is all the uses are in full support, except for the cold water permanent fish life propagation waters use. And the standard for that use for temperature is not being met. This table is straight off of our WQMAP website. If you click on a water body and you click on support status, this is what you get. So it's important to understand that framework if we're gonna talk about water quality standards. There are two types of standards, numeric standards and narrative standards. And I'm not going to spend much time on this because my entire point with this slide is that it's confusing. Numeric standards, as the name implies, they're associated with a discrete number or set of numbers. Narrative standards, on the other hand, are descriptive in nature, such as your lake can't be totally covered in oil and grease. Your lake can't be so toxic that all the life in it dies, and those are kind of exaggerations of narrative standards, but that's the gist of it. But to further compound how confusing this can be, EPA has found a clever way to get states that are resistant to having numeric water quality standards, because states adopt their own standards based on EPA recommendations, but they don't have to adopt all of them. And then EPA can sue them if they want to really try to make them. But instead of going that route, EPA comes at it from the narrative standards, and they say, hey, we think, clicked a button. If your lakes are getting, so green that, maybe they're producing toxins, the algae is, and they're not safe to swim in, we think that some of yours are too green. So we're going to ask you to assign a number for your chlorophyll that represents when they're too green. So basically, they took a narrative standard and assigned a number to it. It's been effective on their part, and we've since adopted numbers for nitrogen, phosphorus, chlorophyll A. And I'll talk about those later. But when I'm talking about standards, I'm basically going to use numeric and narrative interchangeably, because it's too confusing and messed up to try to delve into the details of that. So now I'm going to go through a bunch of all the parameters that you're sampling for the most part, talk about them a little bit, and then look at a little bit of the results from the volunteer samples. First up, we got E. coli, Escherichia coli. This is a fecal contamination indicator. It's basically trying to tell us, is there contamination from warm-blooded animal feces entering our waterway. E. coli itself can make you sick, but it's also an indicator that there's other pathogens present, because if you're getting high levels of E. coli, you've got a whole bunch of other little bugs there too, whether they're bacteria or viruses or whatever that can make people sick. E. coli is a good indicator because not only does it make people sick, it's fairly easy to test for. We have the two uses here with their single sample maximum standards listed, and I'm glad that we went over that before. I won't talk about that too much here. For the volunteers, you all collected 251 E. coli samples last year. That's outstanding. That's a lot of data. I can't put into words how valuable that data is to our society, our state, everything involved. That 251 number doesn't include blank and replicate samples. So actually it's kind of higher than that, about 20% higher. if you're talking number of bottles that you filled. 7.7% of E. coli samples were over the standard. And again, there's multiple standards, but I calculated it all out for the standard for every lake and stream that you guys sampled. There was a stark difference between the exceedance rate, or you could call it violation rate, for lakes and streams. Lakes are way less likely to have a sample that's over the standard. We only had 2 samples out of the 81 collected from lakes that were over the standard, one on Lake Mitchell and one on Lewis and Clark. Streams, on the other hand, 14 out of 111 samples exceeded the standard, 12.6% exceedance rate. I'd like to point out that for most parameters, and E. coli is one of them, if greater than 10% of the samples are over the standard, then we consider that water body impaired. And there's a time frame associated with that, and you have to have enough samples to do that. But basically, you can think of it as if that number is over 10%, bad. If it's under 10%, pretty good. Because one thing about the E. coli standard in particular, it's designed so that if 10% of those samples or less than 10% of those samples exceed the standard, it's still relatively safe. That the coli standards are based on the number of people that will get sick out of 1,000 if they're in the water at that level of E. coli. So this is all based on statistics that if under 10% of your samples are exceeding the standard, it's relatively safe there. In terms of everybody's QA/QC sampling, their blank samples, clicked it again. There was no detectable E. coli in anybody's blanks. That means that everybody did a really great job of not, rubbing their fingers all over the inside of the bottle or, rubbing the inside of the lid or anything else. So great job there. The next parameter we're going to talk about is total suspended solids. I'm going to call it TSS for short. TSS, it's basically dirt, sediment. You can get technical and say the organic and inorganic matter that will not pass through a filter, but it's dirt. It comes from the upland, soil runoff and erosion. It also comes from stream banks that are crumbling and falling in, and streams can often carve down the bed, the stream bed, and that can also generate sediment and suspended solids. The terms sediment and suspended solids are a little different. Suspended solids means the ones that are floating in the water. So like not sand or gravel. We're just talking the stuff that suspends in the water and makes it cloudy. High levels of TSS in certain systems can have negative effects on fish and other aquatic life. They can cover up gravel and rocks that fish need to spawn in. They can smother habitat for invertebrates. They reduce the depth to which light penetrates, which affects plant life. So sediment can have a lot of negative effects on ecosystems. Here's kind of an example of a Black Hills crystal clear stream versus the White River. What's interesting is these are both good. And what's important when you're thinking about sediment is to think, is it the right amount for that stream or lake, or is it too much? Because some systems, like the White River, are very naturally high in suspended solids. The White River drains the Badlands. Anytime there's a little bit of runoff, you got, it looks like chocolate milk flowing into the White River and all the way down it. The fish and invertebrates and everything else that lives in the White River, though, is very adapted to that turbid environment. So it's not necessarily a bad thing there. But if you had that chalky water in a Black Hills stream, it would be very bad, because that would, the trout wouldn't be able to feed. All the bugs they feed on would be smothered by the sediment. You wouldn't have stoneflies and caddisflies and all those cool little bugs. So we have several different sediment standards that are applied to different water bodies. And in some cases, we have what's called site-specific standards, like the White River, where this is a unique environment. It drains the Badlands. We can't hold it to the same standard as a Black Hills stream. These are some of those standards. I won't bore you with getting into these numbers too much, but these are the standards associated with those different fishery beneficial uses. And the cold water ones that applies to the trout streams are on the lower end. Volunteers collected 193 TSS samples last year. Again, to me, these numbers are just eye-popping because these are like the number of samples that we collect for a project or program professionally. And you guys are out there doing this, and it's just amazing to me. Again, that 193 doesn't include blanks and replicates. There was only one blank sample out of 36 that had detectable TSS. So that's also a very good job of people not contaminating their sample bottles. Pretty low exceedance rate on TSS. 5 out of 150 samples were over the standard for a 3.3% exceedance rate. That's very good, especially considering that along with E. coli, TSS is one of the most common pollutants in South Dakota. In terms of water bodies that are impaired, E. coli and TSS make up the bulk of the causes of those impairments. And that's why we sample for them so aggressively as well, is because we know that those are our biggest problems for some of them. At least the biggest problems that we have standards for, which leads me to nutrients. We never really had much for standards for nutrients. That was kind of a political battle that played out over time. And EPA got us in with that narrative standard approach. And so now we sort of have standards for nitrogen and phosphorus. I say sort of. I'm not going to get into that because it's confusing, but we do definitely have standards for chlorophyll, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But first, we're going to start with nitrogen. And this diagram is the nitrogen cycle, and you won't be tested on this, and I won't either, thankfully, because I've probably forgotten most of it. And basically, the takeaway from this diagram is that nitrogen can change forms, and it can do it very rapidly between ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and then organic nitrogen, which I'll get to in a minute. That's going to be nitrogen that's in living things. But talking about nitrate and nitrite first, they can be dangerous to people, nitrate in particular. Over 10 milligrams per liter causes blue baby syndrome. That's why we have a standard at 10 milligrams per liter for domestic water supplies. We have another standard for under that fish, wildlife, propagation, recreation, and stock watering use of 88 milligrams per liter. It's honestly, to me, a laughable standard because never in my career, I think I've been doing this 17, 18 years now, I have never seen a sample that comes anywhere close to 88. I once saw one that was pushing 50 on the James River in a fairly unique event. And I don't understand why the standard is on our books, but it's there. So if there's ever a sample that's over 88 milligrams per liter, I guess, that would be a violation of the standard, but probably never going to happen. Nitrate and nitrite are one common source is drain tile outlets. That's where we tend to see elevated nitrate. That's more common in the southeast part of the state. So volunteers have been doing more sampling for nitrate in the Big Sioux and Basin in particular, the Vermilion as well, I think. Nitrate and nitrite are very readily available to plants and algae to act as a fertilizer. So they have a lot of impacts on the ecosystem, particularly in terms of algal growth. Moving on to ammonia. The main thing about ammonia is that it's toxic to fish. Its toxicity to fish is dependent upon the pH and the temperature. Higher pH means the ammonia is more toxic. So our standard for ammonia is based on an equation that includes the ammonia level, pH, and temperature. I'm not going to put that up there. I think one time I tried to solve the ammonia standard equation, and I'm glad I don't have to do that for my job. I would probably just set that up in Excel and make it automatic because it's hard. It can be converted to nitrate, and it can switch very readily between those forms. And when you have ammonia present, or you have an influx of ammonia into a lake, it can cause blue-green algae to produce and or release higher concentrations of algal toxins. That's a lot of fairly new research that's showing that. So hopefully I've interpreted that all correctly, and that stands the test of time, but that is what the initial data appears to show. So the last form of nitrogen, or I think it's the last one, is total Kjeldahl nitrogen. We just call it TKN. You may have seen this in your results if you're sampling lakes out in the middle of the lake. The name comes from the lab test. I'm pretty sure it was a guy whose last name was Keldall that invented the lab test for this. It's basically a measure of organic nitrogen. So the nitrogen that's bound up in living things. And then also ammonia is combined with that. Other than the ammonia, it's not really readable to plants or readily available to plants and algae for growth. You can, and like I said, it's some of organic nitrogen and ammonia. Most nitrogen in our water bodies is in this form. It's tied up in life because algae and everything else, plants, they take up nitrogen so rapidly that we often find no nitrate in our waters unless there's some kind of human source nearby, or we'll occasionally see nitrite, and ammonia early in the spring, right around ice out, where you haven't had the biological processes going to use those up yet. But in the middle of the summer, it's almost all TKN. Everything just uses that up. So we've talked about 3 types of nitrogen. That's what our tests are. We can do a calculation to get the total nitrogen, which is useful if you just want to think about, okay, well, how much nitrogen do we have in this lake or stream? So on that WQMAP water quality portal for the state, it has a graph in the dashboard screen that shows this value. It's a calculated value from your samples that you collect. It's the sum of total your TKN and your nitrite. For some context, Swan Lake in Turner County, southeast South Dakota, the average total nitrogen is 3.28 milligrams per liter. Swan Lake gets very green, has high algae concentrations. Deerfield Lake in the Black Hills, which is about as close to pristine as we get in this state, has 0.2 average total nitrogen. So a very stark difference. Deerfield Lake is crystal clear. You can see the bottom in 20, 30 feet of water most of the time. So if you have a lot of nitrogen, you're probably going to grow a lot of algae. Our other nutrient that causes algal growth, phosphorus, this is also very important. It's a lot more stable than nitrogen. It doesn't just flip to other forms and stuff. And when you get it into a lake, it's very, very difficult to get it out because it accumulates in the sediments of the lake and just sits there and cooks away and releases some of itself out into the lake and causes algae growth. Sources of phosphorus in the state, we do have fairly high natural levels of phosphorus in the soil. That's part of the reason we're an agricultural state, especially in the eastern half of the state. So you have that fairly high natural phosphorus level to begin with, and then you add intensive agriculture and other anthropogenic sources or human sources on top of that, and that's how you can end up with fairly high phosphorus levels that can cause algae growth. So Mina Lake up near Aberdeen, it has naturally high phosphorus in the soils, and then also there's a lot of intensive agriculture going on there. Average phosphorus of 1.268 milligrams per liter. And then again on Deerfield, you have 0.016 milligrams per liter. Deerfield is mostly pine tree forest and hills compared to Mina Lake, which is mostly cornfields. Like I said, Mina Lake naturally high in it, Deerfield Lake naturally low. Those are the 2 extremes that we see in our state in terms of phosphorus. So nitrogen and phosphorus, they're nutrients, they're basically fertilizers. When you have those in water and you add sunlight and warmth, you grow algae. There's a lot of ways to measure the amount of algae and the kinds of algae in our water, but the easiest one, and it's fairly common and fairly cheap to do, is to collect a chlorophyll sample. And what a chlorophyll sample is some of you have collected quite a few of these. You just collect a bottle of the water in a dark brown bottle so that photosynthesis can't continue to occur and grow more chlorophyll. And then that water is run through a filter. And so it catches all that algae, and that's filters ground up, and then you see what color it is, what the frequency, the wavelengths of light that pass through it are, and you can get an estimate of the amount of total chlorophyll in that water. The amount of chlorophyll is directly related to the amount of algae in that water. So we can use chlorophyll as an indicator of how much algae we have in the water. As I was saying, chlorophyll, we call it a response variable. That means that it is the result of the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and other factors that cause algal growth. We can use the chlorophyll concentration to look at the risk of there being harmful algal toxins there. Anything under 10, very low risk of there being negative health effects, 10 to 50, moderate risk. Over 50, you have a high risk of developing symptoms related to algal toxin exposure. We have 5 standards now for chlorophyll A, and these some of those weird narrative standards that I talked about. I helped develop some of these standards, the 2 Black Hills ones. That was a fun process. For the smaller lakes in the Black Hills, it's 7, and for the large lakes, it's 8 micrograms per liter. There's only 3 large lakes in the Black Hills, Sheridan, Pactola, and Deerfield. Out on the Western Prairie, so everything that's not the Black Hills, but west of the Missouri River, the standard is 14. And then in the Eastern lakes, we broke those into deep and shallow, as far as Eastern South Dakota lakes go, deep and shallow. So deep lakes that are over 15 feet deep, the standard is 20. And for shallow lakes, the standard is 25. You can kind of see the Black Hills has the lowest natural amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. The Western Prairie is kind of a moderate amount of nitrogen and phosphorus. And the Eastern South Dakota soils and natural environment is higher. These standards are supposed to reflect a lake that isn't considered polluted, a lake that's in good shape. So that's the idea. Like the Black Hills ones, we developed them by taking the best lakes and looking at their data and picking a number from their data distribution that represents a good condition for a lake. So here's some of the data from chlorophyll sampling. Well, this is all the chlorophyll samples collected by volunteers in 2023. I highlighted 4 of them, dry lake samples in red or sort of pinkish there. It provides a good example to me on how you get different results when you collect samples using a different method. The Lake Poncet Association is collecting samples at a bridge where dry lake flows into Lake Poncet. So they're right near the shore. And the wind can blow that algae around and it can accumulate there near the shoreline. Dry lake grows a lot of algae anyway, so that might not necessarily be the cause of this, but it probably plays a role. And you can see we have 3 of the 4 highest chlorophyll concentrations come from those samples. All the other samples were collected out in the middle of a lake, which is the normal lake monitoring practice. But we wanted to look at how dry lake was impacting Lake Poncet and get an idea of the water that's coming in there. So this is an important thing about how we collect our samples and where and when and how we do that, and why we standardize things to make sure that everybody kind of does it the same way, because it can really bias the results. But outside of those dry lake samples, Lake Marindal was definitely growing the most algae this year, with Lake Albert and Beaver kind of right behind it. Marindal and Beaver are down near Yankton. Albert is right up near Arlington, kind of by Brookings. So those are the results for the chlorophyll. Microcystin is our most common algal toxin in South Dakota. So if you don't know anything about this, some kinds of algae that we call blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, means the same thing, can produce toxins that can be harmful to people and animals. Microcystin is the most common. It's a hepatotoxin, which means it affects the liver and systems associated with the liver. You can read the symptoms there that come with acute exposure. If you have less acute exposure, just it touching your skin, we've heard and seen reports of sores and rashes that come from interacting with high levels of microcystin. And in that picture there, that's pretty green and gross. That's split pea soup looking water there on Lake Madison. And if you see water like that, please don't get in it. Don't let your pets in it. That's probably a toxic situation. Not only is our chlorophyll concentration there extremely high from the algae, but there's so much algae there, and they're probably blue-green algae, that they're producing toxins. I believe that this was a very quite toxic sample that was collected at this location. Microcystin it affects, well, let me start over. Animals other than humans are very sensitive to microcystin. Humans are less sensitive to it. To my knowledge, there has never been a human death from microcystin, but it can kill pets, livestock, and wildlife quite quickly, like within a matter of 15, 20 minutes. There's been reports of livestock and wildlife drinking out of a contaminated pond, and they find them dead with their mouths still in the water, laying down as they were still drinking. In terms of like our lives and how we go about recreating with water, the biggest risk to people is when we're either swimming or boating, jet skiing, things like that, or when we bring our pets to the lake. This water right there could very well kill your dog or make it very sick. So if you'd like to bring your dog or pets to the lake, this is something you want to watch out for. And as I've gone along in my career, it's something where I go to a lake and I see it's pretty green and I see kids playing around or people with their dogs. And then I always face the dilemma of, do I go tell them that this is dangerous? And yes, of course I do, but nobody ever wants to hear it. That's why we sample for this. We've been developing a program to sample for this since about 2018, 2019. This is a fairly new thing that's been being monitored in South Dakota. Me and a few of my coworkers collected the first microcystin samples in the state back around 2018. And EPA came out with a standard recommendation for it that South Dakota has adopted at 8 micrograms per liter. And so a lot of you do microcystin sampling. One update, we've had problems with Midwest Labs shipping your coolers to you on time. We're pretty positive we're going to be going with a different lab next year. It will cost us more money, but they will provide way, 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 way better service. So these are all the microcystin samples that were collected this year. I'd like you to note on the left side of this graph, the y-axis, that's in logarithmic scale. So as you can see, it goes from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000. It increases by orders of magnitude. So this can be a little deceiving, but it's the only way to fit all the results onto the graph, because the Lake Mitchell samples were so high that all the other sample results would just look like little specks instead of bars if I had it the axis at a normal scale. Lake Mitchell had the 4 highest microcystin results, all 1,000 or over. Remember, the standard is 8. The line there, the sort of orange line, is at the standard level. Lake Mitchell is one of the most impaired lakes in the state when it comes to microcystin. We also had a high sample at Lake Marindal. Lake Poncet had a couple. And I think Albert had another, but I'm not sure if that exceeded the standard, but I'm not sure if that was one that volunteers collected or that our staff collected. When a water body, particularly a lake, has a microcystin sample that exceeds that standard of 8 micrograms per liter, we put out what's called a harmful algal bloom notification. We're trying to get that term changed to a harmful algal bloom advisory. We're going to see if the managers will let us do that, because a harmful algal bloom notification doesn't sound very serious. It sounds like maybe you got a harmful algal bloom friend request or something, and you know it's not very strong language for what's in essence a risky situation. So we put out what's called a notification, and we put a little red flag on our harmful algal blooms map to note that, hey, if you use this map shows all of the results from microcystin samples that volunteers collect, as well as all the ones that we collect for our staff. And this is a screen capture of the map as it stands right now with 2023 results. And all those red flags are where we had a sample over the standard. Let's see, where am I? Okay, I was going to show you then So this is our web page, the DANR web page. We don't just put the little red flag on the map when we have a sample over the microsystem standard. We have a special harmful algal blooms webpage where we list all the lakes that were over the standard and the date that that occurred. And when we put out that notification, that persists for the calendar year, because if a lake exceeds that microsystem standard, say in July, it's probably going to do it again at some point throughout the season. Maybe it'll stay above it for most of the year. We just don't know, because we don't have the resources to go and monitor that on, say, a daily or even weekly basis. We just let that notification persist throughout the calendar year. If you want to learn more about blue-green algae or harmful algal blooms, that's what we call it when a water body produces so much algae that it causes problems. This website has a lot of really good information. I helped design this website, and this little gizmo down here is called a story map. And I'm just going to pop this out in its own window. And this tells you everything you want to know about harmful algal blooms and blue-green algae, where it comes from, what it does to people and pets. And you can scroll through this, look at the pictures, read the text, learn about the different algal species and the different toxins. So that is what I had. Does anybody have any questions about any of that stuff that you've been saving up, or we got anything in the chat that we want to get to? No?
I have a
Okay.
question, Jesse.
Yes?
This is Suzanne Skirm.
Hi.
Hi. So does the EPA get involved with this at all when you have a lake or a stream that continuously seems to go over the standard
And are you talking for microsystem or for any kind of
for any of it,
parameter?
any of the parameters? I guess mostly the microsystem and also E. coli.
So I wouldn't say that they get involved, because that part of it is left to the states under the Clean Water Act for the most part. They do definitely keep tabs on it, though. We're required by the Clean Water Act to produce that integrated report of surface water quality that the EPA has to approve it. They have to look through it all, go through it with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that, states aren't filling them full of BS, and that they're actually reporting the conditions of their waters accurately and fairly. I think that I haven't seen it a lot in South Dakota where EPA gets actively involved, though I will say, particularly with microcystin and harmful algal blooms, they're very aware of what's going on in the state. They're routinely checking this map and communicating with us about what we're seeing in our sample results. We've gotten a lot of kudos for the volunteer efforts to collect these samples, as well as what we do ourselves, because 5 years ago, we didn't do any kind of monitoring for this, and EPA was pushing us quite aggressively to do this. And at the time in our management, there was resistance to doing anything about it. We kind of finally had those training wheels taken off, and they set the scientists free, and we're like, we're going to go collect 1 million of these samples. That made EPA a lot happier, because they wanted us to do that and had been pushing us to do that. So I wouldn't say that they get involved, but they are definitely keeping tabs on it and actively working to make sure that states are monitoring this and trying to prevent it where possible, although it's very difficult to prevent once you have nutrient enrichment in the lake already. It's about the best answer I can give you on that. They don't really get involved on the ground. It's more of a keeping tabs.
So if a body of water continuously exceeds the standards, then nobody's going to go out and do anything about it?
No, that's not the case. Now, we do a lot of things about it. You asked about EPA. The EPA isn't really a boots on the ground agency. They don't actually do a lot of work themselves. They hire contractors to do it. But part of the Clean Water Act is that states are allowed to set their own water quality standards and sort of handle these things themselves. And so what happens when a lake or a stream is considered impaired, we don't just report on it and put it in a report and say, hey, that's bad. That's an important step of the process, though. So what happens when a water body is considered impaired? First, we go and we have to, under Clean Water Act, write a report called a Total Maximum Daily Load Report that details where the pollution is coming from and how much it needs to be reduced to fix the problem. And then also at the same time or afterward, we have what's called implementation projects or water quality restoration projects throughout the state. Not everywhere, but we have a lot in eastern South Dakota in particular, that we take Clean Water Act money from EPA and we put it towards actual on-the-ground improvements, whether it's renovating a feedlot that's bad or assisting a farmer to renovate that feedlot or providing funding to keep cattle out of the stream. It's not a regulatory approach. It's more of a, we try to get landowners and producers to participate by giving them a cost share to do things in a more water quality friendly way. There is really no political will in South Dakota to have that regulatory approach. Some other states have that. That's not the case here, being a heavily agricultural state. So essentially, we try to throw some money at the problem. We have been able to clean up some streams and get them to not be impaired anymore. Skunk Creek near Sioux Falls is a fairly good success story of where we were able to work with landowners to keep their cattle further from the stream and fence off the stream and put in alternative sources of water. And that means less E. coli getting into the water and less cattle beating up the stream bed and banks and causing sediment issues. So that's kind of the approach. It isn't that nothing happens, it's that it's done on more of a state and a local level than a federal level.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So yeah, though all of your sampling, your sample results are used to determine if a water body is impaired. And then if it is impaired, those are the things that happen. That total maximum daily load report, where's the pollution, where it's coming from, and then how do we fix this? We can't fix everything in the state. We have, a lot of water bodies and a lot of water bodies with problems, but we do the best that we can with the resources that we have. And that's our program, Jordan and I's program, the Watershed Protection Program, that does that work. I'm on the assessment side where we go collect the data, try to figure out what's wrong. And then we have the other side of our program, which is the implementation team, where they run projects with local sponsors, such as the East Dakota Water Development District, James River Water Development District, and others, try to fix those issues.
Great.
Any other
did you have another question, Suzanne?
No, thank you.
Okay. Jesse, since we have a few minutes, I know some folks who were on the call last year saw, but we do have some new people this year. And I know it'll take a moment to bring up, but could you bring up the map where volunteers can go and see their data mapped? And it takes a moment. So while he's bringing that up, I'm assuming we can still do that. Is that, yeah.
I've just kind of always got that open. So.
Oh, what are the chances?
We'll get to the normal Zoom here. Yeah, so this is called WQ Map. I actually designed this website, had a lot of fun doing so. All those yellow dots are your stations, or our stations, where samples are being collected. And then all the blue and green lines, and then the lakes are also color-coded in blue and green. Blue water bodies are in full support of all their beneficial uses. So all the standards for all the uses for that water body are being met. The red ones, at least one water quality standard is not being met. So that allows you to easily see, is this water classified as impaired or not? And again, it only takes one impairment to classify it as red. So, one common thing that we see is that a lake has high mercury concentrations in the fish, so then it's color-coded red. That mercury is naturally occurring. There isn't an actual water quality issue with that lake, but it's still coded red. But it's a legitimate issue. You don't want to eat too many of the fish there, even though it's natural in origin. So red means impaired. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't eat the fish there, you can't swim or whatever. So if we zoom in, and is it okay if I take a minute and go through a water body on here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So let's pick one. Let's do the lower segment 13 of the James, or 11, excuse me. So when we click on a water body, we have this pop-up window show up with 4 options: the dashboard, support status, monitoring data, and projects and reports. If we click on water quality dashboard, it'll open up a page with a series of graphs. And hopefully this one doesn't take a long time to open. You know, I've already got Pactola open. Maybe this will go faster. Nope. I once had to present this website to the legislature, and that it decided to stop working in the middle of my presentation to the legislature, which was a bit of a problem. Okay, there we go. We'll go back to the James. Okay, so on the water quality dashboard, can you guys see my cursor on the screen, or can only I see that?
You can see it.
You must not be able to see it.
No, I can see it. Yeah.
I
Okay,
can
cool.
see it.
We can
All
see
right, cool.
something scrolling around. Yeah.
Okay. Up here is the water quality dashboard. That's what we're on right here. It has a series of graphs. They're different for lakes and streams that shows the last 5 years of results. So we have total nitrogen here, total phosphorus, where you can really see a seasonal pattern there, can't you? Total suspended solids, also a seasonal pattern. E. coli. Oh, and the lines on here are for the standards. We have 2 lines on the E. coli graph. That top line is for that single sample maximum or daily maximum. The lower line is for the 30-day geometric mean. So it provides context for samples, and at least the best that we can do. And we also include mercury results from fish on here where available. So the last time mercury was sampled in the James River looks like 2018. And if you hover over these dots, you can see the mercury concentration for each fish, the species of fish, and the size of that fish. That's cool because it can give you an idea of what fish you may not want to eat. So you'll notice here, all these fish that are over the standard line of 0.3, these are all flathead catfish. Flathead catfish eat other fish, mercury bioaccumulates in them, and consequently you have a higher concentration in your flatheads. Down here though, channel catfish on the other hand, are omnivores, and they don't just eat fish, so they get less mercury bioaccumulation, and they have less mercury in their flesh. So if you look at this, you probably want to eat the channel catfish and not the flathead catfish. So that's the dashboard. Support status. I showed you this on Pactola earlier. It shows you the beneficial uses and whether they're being support, and then which parameter is impaired that's causing the lack of support for that beneficial use. Monitoring data, if you click that, it will show you all the water quality stations associated with that water body. You can see SCY here. That's the, I think, Guy can correct me if I'm wrong, the former Sierra Club of Yankton, their sites along the James River. We have this projects and reports tab here also. This used to be really awesome until DANR rebuilt their whole webpage and broke all the links to the documents, and I don't think these links work right now. And yep, and we haven't fixed that yet because we're going to rebuild this whole website because the state BIT agency hasn't done a great job of providing us support for it. So we're going to rebuild it on a whole separate platform. It'll be generally the same and have the same information, but we won't have problems with the state IT agency. The guy that helped me build this thing, he quit and he took a job somewhere else, and nobody else seems to know how to fix it. And I'm not a coder guy. I'm more the idea guy for it. So we've had problems getting it fixed when things break. And it's always been slow. So that's why it's slow. It's not anyone's fault on that. But. So that is WQ map, if anybody has any questions about that. It's a fairly useful tool for looking at your water resources and seeing what kind of condition they're in.
Do you color code the monitoring stations for volunteer versus staff?
Uh, There currently isn't, and I had originally planned to do that, but I didn't want the volunteer data to be viewed, I guess, differently from our data, because the data that volunteers are collecting is and should be the same level of quality as what we're collecting, or at least very close to it. So I didn't want there to be like two classes of data. Hey, we've got the DA&R nice data, and then we've got the volunteer data over here. It's something that we can probably put in the future. We actually had that feature to begin with, but it was for a now defunct volunteer program, and that data wasn't as good. So it really did justify having a different color dot. But if you guys have ideas, if that's something you want, we can certainly discuss that. I just didn't want there to be a second class of data. You can see there are green dots. Those are fish flesh collection locations where GF&P collects fish flesh for mercury analysis. And if that'll open up, all those sites start with the prefix FF for fish flesh. So there you see, oh, FFLD, fish flesh Lake Dimmock, for Dimmock Lake there. So those are the green ones. Yellow is everything else. I think if you actually go in the legend over here, yeah, it shows citizen monitoring is a different color. Yeah, maybe we'll code that into the next one, maybe not. We don't call you guys citizens monitoring. We call you volunteers now. It's basically the same concept, but that was what we called the old program that wasn't as good as you guys, to be frank about it. You guys collect real samples that go to real labs. And so your data is consequently more valuable to us, because we can only use samples sent to real labs for water quality regulation and assessment, and like determining if it's impaired. You have to be using the correct methods that are approved by EPA to do that. So that's what you guys do. The citizens monitoring with the kind of orange dot, they weren't doing that. So that's why I consider you guys a yellow dot. Yours are real chemistry samples.
Yeah, I was conflating what I knew that used to be there. So anyway, I
Sure.
I don't feel the need to differentiate. And
Okay.
if there's interest in a deeper dive, we could perhaps have a tutorial evening, half an hour for those who want to walk through this. We have
Sure.
about 2 minutes. Any last questions before I close up with housekeeping? Including, if Jesse mentioned at the top, if you have questions about the monitoring itself, something that came up while you were in the field, if you have any feedback for him regarding the training, this would be a good time to bring that forward.
I'm sorry I blabbed for a long time, so not much
Oh,
time left
it
for
was
that.
good. It was very good, Jesse. Don't apologize. This was.
I just wonder if we could take samples for E. coli and microsystems more often than once a month, especially in a lake with recreation.
Yeah, you certainly can. It really comes down to whether or not you're able and willing to collect those. There's usually, and I encourage people not to bite off more than you can chew, because it's easy when you're sitting around in November or December to say, yeah, I'm gonna go collect all these samples. And then May, June, July comes around and you got stuff going on, and you are volunteers. It's not like this is your job and you're out getting paid to do this. I do caution people to not bite off more than you can chew, because there is a measure of quality of your data that, like, what percentage of the samples that you plan to collect did you collect? We call that the completeness measure, and you want to be above 90% to have your data respected as good quality data. So yeah, you can if you are willing to collect them, but I would just caution you not to write checks that your volunteers can't cash.
So that brings up a question for me. So a lot of our streams have been dried up for the last few years. And so we're lucky maybe to get one sample out of a stream. So how does that work? Does that mean we need to collect samples from that stream for 10 years to have a reliable source of data?
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually going over some of your data in your streams just recently here, because you've hit your 5-year period. I think, or you haven't, maybe it's 4 years, you now have enough samples on, which one was it? Clay Creek, for
Right.
us to create an assessment unit ID and have that assessed and reported on in the integrated report. So a lot of you might not know this. In a stream, you have to have 20 samples collected over the last 5 years to assess it and determine whether it's impaired or not. Suzanne's group hit that mark on one of their streams, but were not able to hit that 20 samples on some of the others because they were often dry. So I think that the only solution to that is to, outside of hoping it rains, is to sample more frequently. So if you're sampling on a monthly basis, May through September, you're going to get 5 samples a year. Over 4 years, you'll hit 20 samples. But if you miss even one sample, you're going to wind up short. And you can't collect a sample if there's no water there. And we don't collect a sample if the water's not flowing, because it's not going to be really representative of that water body in its normal state. So I would say the only solution is to sample twice a month, or maybe I'd hate to say collect extra samples in certain months when it's wetter, because then you're kind of biasing your data seasonally. I would just say, on those streams, you might want to shoot for 2 a month. That might not solve the problem either, because when it's dry, it's dry. You know, if it's dry on July 15th, it's probably dry on July 31st too.
Yeah.
So that's tough. In a sense, you'd almost tell yourself, is it even appropriate to assess this water body for impairment when it's dry half the time?
Right.
So it's a tough spot, Suzanne, and you guys have done a wonderful job there, doing everything you can do. And you made it on Clay Creek. I meant to hit you up actually and send you an email to let you know that, hey, you hit your 20 samples on Clay Creek, and we're going to get a line put on that WQ map there that will be either blue or red, that shows the condition of this water body now, because nobody was sampling that before.
Okay, great. So if we kept sampling say, for example, Ash Creek, which is almost always dry, if we just kept doing that for like years from now, would we be able to use the samples eventually, or?
Well, the samples don't get tossed in the trash or anything. They'll still be out there until the end of time, as a record of what was occurring in that water body on that day. But the problem with that is that when we look at data for a stream, we only go back the last 5 years.
Oh,
so if you can't get 20 samples in the last 5 years, it can't be assessed. And that's really where your conundrum lies, is you could keep sampling for another 10 years, but if it's still dry half the time, you're not going to get enough samples. I'd almost say, and then maybe this is a discussion I should have with the rest of our staff over whether this would be injecting too much bias into it, or maybe when it's wet, we write your plan so you collect extra samples. Hey, we've got a good wet year. We're going to sample twice a month, something like that, or even 4 times a month, or whatever what would be reasonable to you, I guess that's about the only solution that I can think of right now without discussing it with others.
Okay. So going forward, if we've already done our 5 years, then should we keep doing it for Clay Creek?
It's kind of up to you. I would say, yeah. Part of the staff that does this stuff with creating those assessment units and putting that on the map and everything, they usually want to have a commitment that somebody is going to continue to sample this, at least the best that they can, so because we don't like to have those assessment units, lakes or streams out there, where we don't have enough data to assess them, because then we have to mark it as insufficient data. We can't assess it. And it's kind of a black eye for us in our reporting to EPA that, hey, we're not doing a good job of assessing our water bodies. So if there isn't a commitment to continue sampling a water body, our agency doesn't kind of want to start in the first place, because then you assess it once and then it's abandoned and it's out there and we quit monitoring it. We don't have data. But in a much more meaningful and broader sense, I would totally encourage you to keep sampling it, because you are the only people creating a record of what's going on in that water body that will stand the test of time. So that's, to me, is much more important than, some bureaucratic processes.
Sure. Cool. Well, I think the will is certainly there. I mean, people are happy to do it. So
Cool. You all have done a great job.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, Jesse, the integrated report is produced every 2 years.
Correct. We'll have one coming out in April of 2024. Our staff is doing those assessments right now with all of your data and all of our data and any other data that we have to figure out if there's new impairments, if old impairments are still impaired, et cetera.
Well, we've gone a little bit past, and I know people have other things they need to do. So, um, oh, so I just want to make a housekeeping announcement and turn off the live stream. And then if you need to leave, please do. Jesse and or Jordan, if you could hang on for a few last questions. So a couple of housekeeping items. One is if you monitored this past year or you supervise or coordinate a group of people, like I know Suzanne, you do, Deb, you do, you will get a pin, but I need your mailing address. I tr I tried that last year, and I couldn't get the mailing addresses. But this year, this is how we're going to do it. If I can get your address by November 30th, you will get a little volunteer. I think it's the shape of a water drop.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's just something you can, if you're a master naturalist, you can wear it on your lanyard. If you're not, you can just wear it wherever you think it will make you look cool and like get people buy you drinks or something like that. The other thing that we're going to do starting next year, and we'll go more into it next year, is if you this is optional, but if you would like to have support in your mileage, our program can pay up to 60% of your mileage as you drive to collect samples. Because I was chatting with Rebecca offline the other day, and she said it's 100 miles round trip for her to do her samples, and I feel like that's a lot. So it's going to require some bookkeeping and some forms and things like that. But I feel like, you're not getting paid for this. The state is getting a lot of data. I have a pretty generous pot of funding to support this, and we want to support you however we can. So 60% of your mileage, we can find a way to cover that. So those are the two housekeeping items. I'm going to stop the live stream and